All right, I've hit the record button.
All right, excellent. So to jump in for today's agenda, today we're going to spend about 10 minutes together talking about an overview. So thinking about our grant's purpose, what the funding rounds will look like, and also our multilingual accessibility. Then we'll spend about 15 minutes reviewing the application process, so everything from reviewing the application questions to when you hit the submit button, how the evaluation process will work, and also what awarding will generally look like. And then we'll briefly touch on for just a few minutes our application help and assistance, which we're doing one of those now today, experiencing it live. And then we will wrap up with a Q&A portion, which we are looking forward to discussing all your questions and feedback at that time. So if you have questions during the presentation, please add them to the chat. Kat will be monitoring that space and compiling questions as we go. So to start, next slide. Perfect. So looking at air pollution in Boston, giving some context, the purpose of this grant is to reduce air pollution and carbon emissions in Boston, in particular at the neighborhood and community level. There's, several reasons why this is important to the city of Boston. Air pollution exists in the city of Boston. We also know there's a disproportionate impact. So air pollution in Boston affects some of our communities more than others. And that can include communities that live near highways or other major transportation infrastructure, and also can disproportionately impact our socially vulnerable populations, including our people of color, our older residents, children, people with chronic illnesses, etc. And then we also know that we have health and environmental impacts related to air pollution, and the fact that air pollution contributes to higher rates of cardiovascular and respiratory diseases like asthma. And in our current times, we also know that it's linked to higher COVID-19 mortality rates. So bringing some very recent levity to the situation. Some air pollutants like methane and carbon dioxide are also greenhouse gases, which means there's retention of heat in the atmosphere, leading to the effects of climate change, which Boston is also very vulnerable to, including greater flooding, increased storms, and more frequent and intense heat waves. So this grant is one more thing. Sorry, go back. So this grant is has the goal of looking at ways to improve this, which is the core goal of the grant. It's to uplift and bring visibility to community-driven projects that reduce air pollution and carbon emissions. There are broad ways to think about this, in eliminating sources of air pollution, shifting from polluting to clean energy sources, improving our indoor quality with air filters, and also education and awareness. And more specifically, you can see on the right of the screen, we'll be looking for in awarded projects that they have one or many of the following: reduce air pollution and carbon emissions, help improve public health and combat climate change on a local level, bring visibility to community-driven projects, supports Boston's goal of carbon neutrality by 2050, while also bringing short-term benefits to our neighborhoods. So taking a quick look into our funding overview. Yeah, perfect. The maximum award available to any individual, business, or nonprofit will be $50,000. One important note to make when thinking about your application is the evaluation committee will consider proposals that request excess funding beyond $50,000 and be assessing that on potential impact. So there is the potential for excess funding, but it's important in your proposal that you explicitly state and demonstrate the added value and impact from that excess funding. And this funding, the funding from the grant comes from the Air Pollution Control Commission, that administers programs that promote clean air. So the pilot program is funded by the Pollution Abatement Fund, which supports programs that supports program administration and pollution abatement. So for this first year of funding, which there's 3 funding rounds, the total allocated amount of dollars is $350,000. So a little bit more into funding, looking at their funding rounds. So we launched the grant April 26th, which was very exciting. So just over a week ago. This grant is going to be a rolling submission grant, which means 2 things. First, your initial proposal submission will be reviewed during the upcoming funding round. So that means if you submit your application between now and June 4th, your application will be considered for that round 1 of funding, just as if you submitted your application between January 28th or September 24th and January 28th, your application will be considered for that 3rd round of funding. So you can submit your application anytime throughout now and January 28th. It just differs which funding round you'll be considered for. So the second part of that is if your proposal is not selected in that initial funding round that you submitted for, and we see it as like a viable and feasible project, it will automatically be carried over to be reviewed in that next funding round with that next set of applications. So if you submit for the first round and are not awarded, we'll reconsider that proposal in the subsequent second round of funding. So, and given that framework, the most important note is that your applications are valid 1 year from the date that you submit it. So if you submit it on June, or May 7th, it's good to May 7th the next year. The important note here, as you can see noted, March 2022, we'll be assessing future rounds of funding throughout the next year and what's viable. So currently there's only 1 year of funding allocated to this grant. So there's no guarantee of funding beyond that 3rd submission date of January 28th. We hope for that to happen. Stay tuned. But if you want your application to have the most chances of being considered earlier, the better. So the grant is set up this way to allot as much time and several opportunities for applicants to prepare, submit, and have their applications reviewed. So we hope you take advantage of this framework and setting. And one last note on this is we don't intend for any of the submission dates to change. The June 4th one is there to stay. We don't intend on the other ones changing, but please, check in every once in a while on the grant webpage, which is linked throughout this presentation and down below, just in case. So, perfect. So one of the last parts in the overview we want to touch on is our multilingual accessibility. So all the application materials have been translated into the following languages. We have English, Spanish, traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, Vietnamese, and Cape Verdean Creole. If you don't see your language, please email us at Boston.gov if you'd like those materials translated. These languages are based off of the Mayor's Office of Language Access Guidelines. And so, but we are here to get any and all languages translated to, yep, perfect. And then to just give a sense of the materials, which we will dive into a few of these later on, looking at the application process, but the application, the budget form, the questions preview, evaluation criteria, partnership form, which we'll touch on in a second, and the social media toolkit have all been translated. In addition, we have interpretation available for every stage of this process. So we have interpretation for these information sessions. We'll be hosting weekly office hours, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But when you sign up, you can identify a language accommodation. And at any step of the application process, if interpretation services are needed, the city is here to provide them. So just to give a little visual context, the text may be a little small, but hopefully the visuals are there. On the left and the further back is what the application form will look like. And so that very first page will take you to like an overview, and then you can select your language. Once you select your language, it will take you to your version or your translated version of the application. And then in front of that with the B on it is an example of some of the translated materials. So this is the application question review. On that very first page, again, it will just ask you to select your language. And when you click on it, a little box comes up, you click on that and it will take you to your translated part section of the material. So. And then last but not least, so not only can you review your materials in your preferred language, but this grant will allow, we're going to be accepting applications in your preferred language. So if you prefer to submit your application in Haitian Creole, you may do so. And our team will complete all the necessary work on our side to ensure your application is able to be reviewed just as an English application would be. So we'll stop here for a second and ask if there are any questions. We'll give everyone a minute to digest all that information. And if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute.
It looks like Jan has a question. Jan, I'm going to ask you to unmute now.
Hi, I have a question about the funding. I mean, not the funding, the awarded projects.
Yes.
And how it would fix air pollution.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is like how this will like fix like air pollution at, like around Boston, or like what communities are greatly like affected by air pollution?
That's a great question. I think we're going to jump into a little bit of that later on in the presentation, if you don't mind holding on to that. And if you feel like we don't get it answered, then I'm more than happy to like rehear it as well. But I would say, in short, there are definitely different neighborhoods that are disproportionately impacted. We know neighborhoods around highways like Roxbury, we have Chinatown that are disproportionately impacted. East Boston faces a lot with the airport, et cetera, being there. And there's a lot of different avenues in order to abate abate air pollution. And part of this grant is intended to see and hear creative solutions that take direct action to address that. So we can get into more specifics later, if that's okay. But an absolutely important question to be asked. So.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Victoria, we also have a question in the chat. It might be most applicable after the next set of slides, but the question is, how do we use the fund for a specific grant project? Or specifically his grant project?
Okay, yeah, we'll touch on that. I'm gonna make a note to make sure we bring it up. Yeah, we will. Okay, so let's dive in. Lots of questions about the application process and different resources. So let's jump into that. So we'll start with the submission side of things. I know this is a little text heavy, but I will provide the verbal insights into all of it. We want to make sure you get your information. So as far as eligibility Any individual or entity who would like to respond may. This includes individuals, nonprofit organizations, and businesses. These projects must be located within Boston, so that's an important note to make. And the city definitely encourages participation from our small, local, minority-owned, women-owned, and other disadvantaged enterprises and entities. And one of those ways to support getting as many projects and partnerships going, in this grant, we have a partnership form. So we, as a city, definitely encourage to see partnerships with local community groups and partners. And sometimes people have great ideas, some people have great teams, and be able to merge those together in certain incidents can be a really fruitful endeavor. So if you are interested in collaborating with others on a potential clean air project, we have a form on the grant webpage. It's very short, it's only a couple questions, most of it's optional, where you can add your contact information, and it will be added to a publicly available list. And then on the other side, you can also view that list of partners to see if there's a good fit and get in touch to have that conversation. So that is a tool we definitely hope to see used to form some great proposals. One last note to make is on multiple submissions. So any individual, nonprofit, or business, you may submit more than one proposal. You have several great ideas floating around. It's important to note that you will only be awarded a maximum of one project per fiscal year though. So even if you submit a few applications, at most one application or proposal can be funded in a fiscal year. So. And then a few more points on the submission side of things, preparing to apply. So these are important notes as you get your proposal together to submit in the application form. So your proposal focus, this relates a lot to the overview we had just a few moments ago. So it's important to call out if your proposal will have at least one of the following. Many would be also great. So eliminate or otherwise address point sources of air pollution within Boston, mitigate the negative health impacts of air pollution emissions within Boston, enhance the ability of local communities in Boston to improve air quality, and or have a measurable impact on air quality or carbon emissions within Boston. So that's a nice little list also available on the website to start framing your project. As for budget, this goes back to the funding side of things. The maximum award amount will be $50,000. So keep that into consideration as you form your budget and your project scope. And as I mentioned earlier, the evaluation committee will review proposals that request funding in excess of $50,000. It's just very important in your application to explicitly state and prove why that extra funding is necessary and the impacts that it will have. And then as for timeline, project timeline duration should be a maximum of 1 year. Similar to the budget though, if you feel like a timeline in excess of a year is necessary to complete your project in the best way possible, the evaluation committee will review that proposal. Just make sure again in your application you explain and outline as clearly as possible why that extra time is needed. And yep, a few more notes on prepare to apply. I want you to be as prepared as possible. So this kind of connects to one of those earlier questions around which neighborhoods are impacted, the changes that can be seen. So we provided a non-exhaustive list of some resources to help frame your projects. given that this grant should be community and neighborhood focused, and looking at understanding the disproportionate impacts that air pollution can have. So we have the Climate Ready Boston Map Explorer, which overlays different environmental impacts like heat, sea level rise, et cetera, in neighborhoods, along with the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Viewer and the Center for Disease Control's asthma rate map, which we know asthma is a big indicator of air pollution. So those are potential resources, not an exhaustive list, but a starting list to help frame your projects. We've also provided the evaluation criteria online, which we'll get into the specifics of that later. But that is also there to help you know how we'll be reviewing projects. And then last but not least, the vendor ID. So in order to apply for this grant, you will have to submit your City of Boston vendor ID. This ID will be essential in making sure that an awarding process happens efficiently and effectively, which is what we want to make sure that we have as seamless a process as possible. So it's important for you to sign up for your vendor ID, which you can do proactively before you submit your application at that link down there, Boston.gov/procurement. All this information is also provided on the webpage, so you don't have to feverishly type it all down if you don't want to. But there's also technical support available through the email listed there or that phone number. And then once you've gone through all of that, it's time to complete your application. So once you begin your application, it is a Google form. You will not have the option to save your work. So to account for this, we've provided a questions preview document. So all the questions that you will see on the application are in a Google Doc, and you can make your own copy of that, and you could use it to help start writing out your grant. You can use it however you would like, but all the questions are there for you to review. So you can kind of just drop and fill your responses into the form. And then we've touched on this, but just to reiterate that the applications are accepted on a rolling basis and are going to be reviewed 3 times a year. So the application submission deadlines are Friday, June 4th is the first one. And then Friday, September 24th, 2021, and September 28th, 2022, or not September, excuse me, January 28th, January 28th, 2022, too many dates. So, and midnight, 11:59 will be the hard cutoff on all of those. Okay, and then just to quickly touch upon the latter phases of this grant process, the evaluation process. So the evaluation criteria has been provided online. So just giving a high level overview, the criteria is broken out into the scope of your project, your work plan, and also your team. And woven throughout all of these, we'll also ask you to explicitly talk about how equity is addressed in every aspect of your proposal. So in your scope, work plan, and team. From the internal side, we'll have a committee from a variety of different departments, since air pollution kind of transcends just the environment. We'll have representation from the Boston Transportation Department, the Boston Public Health Commission, the Office of the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, and the Mayor's Office of Equity and Inclusion. And as for the process, the committee will be the group to make the final decision on who is awarded grants at each round. Okay. And then the final space, we have awarding. So awarding rounds will be approximately a month to 6 weeks after the deadlines. So in this first round, we expect to be able to make announcements in mid-July, and all the subsequent dates as well will be about a month to 6 weeks after that. So awarded projects, you'll receive an award letter and an email, which will kind of jumpstart the process of having conversations with us. And as I mentioned earlier, proposals that are not selected, we will be notifying you still, and your proposal will automatically be carried over to be evaluated in the next round of funding. So your proposals expire 1 year from the original submission date. And I'll also make a note, if you prefer for your proposal not to be re-reviewed, we can have that conversation at that time, but they will automatically be moved into the next round if we don't hear otherwise. So for awarded projects, there will be obviously a lot of conversations between us as the city and the awarded projects, but two of the main points that will be addressed are progress checks. So within your proposal, we ask that in your work plan, you set out milestones or deliverables so that we can kind of work in progress checks to check in and make sure that we're providing the support necessary for you to succeed in your proposals. So based on your project size, your deliverables, and your milestones, we will designate some progress checkpoints between us and the project team for during your timeline. And then also worked within this, one of the biggest goals of this grant is to be able to kind of uplift and bring visibility to the great work that's already been going on or continuing to go on as it gets funded. So we'll be working with you and our communications team to spotlight your projects, both in progress and also once they're complete. We will be making space on our webpage, et cetera, to highlight that work. So. And then before we jump into our Q&A, I just want to take a few minutes to highlight our application help resources. So first we have our information sessions, which are happening as we speak. We had one on Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. and we have the one right now. So, both these webinars will be recorded and shared online on the grant webpage. And more importantly, for the upcoming, we also have weekly office hours throughout the entire duration of this first grant season. So they'll be every Wednesday from 3 to 5 p.m. They'll be virtual given our current COVID status. And when you sign up, which there's a link on the webpage, you can indicate if you have a language accommodation need. We also understand that sometimes people just can't make Wednesdays. So if you have an alternative time, you can also schedule that with us by emailing apcc@Boston.gov, and we'll work with you. Okay. So with that, we'll move into our Q&A section. We have about 15 to 20 minutes to answer any and all questions. And all questions are great questions. We learn as much from you as hopefully you'll learn from us. So, and Kat will we'll move one more slide forward just for some assistance. You can either use the chat function or raise your hand and unmute yourself.
It looks like Jan has raised their hand, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
I have 2 more questions.
Okay. Awesome.
Right. So my first question is like, how is this plan gonna like affect like the lower income communities?
So I think there's several ways to answer that question. So a lot of times disproportionate health impacts also overlap, like environmental justice communities often overlap with socio and economically like depressed communities as well. And so the intention of this grant is to have proposals that focus, that, have a proportion of the grants that focus on environmental justice communities. And so, in that regards, there's some impact. One of the goals also is to have the rolling submission period to allow organizations that don't necessarily always have the human capital on the front end just to put together a proposal in 6 weeks. And we also want to be able to provide those weekly office hours and be able to have consistent conversations and provide that technical assistance to make sure that as many organizations from any type of background have the assistance needed to be able to be a part of this process and have proposals reviewed. So
I would add that we can't say right now what the impact is going to be. Some of that is going to depend directly on what kinds of proposals and applications we see and what ends up getting funded. And so we'll be able to have a much better sense of the impact that this can have on air quality in a given neighborhood and how that might be able to benefit the members of that community once we know what's in the applications that we receive. So stay tuned.
Thanks. One more question. I know that this fund is to like help the community, like like get together and stuff. But internally, like what's Boston's plan to like clean up the air pollution, like the mayor's office and like the environmental team over here?
it's a great question. Kat, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, we have a lot of different programs in place and programs that we're continuing to develop. This is one sort of newer program that we're hoping can sort of build out that work. I would encourage you to check out a lot of work that the Boston Public Health Commission does around sort of environmental health. They do a lot of work around asthma and lead removal. Another way that we're working on this problem is all of the work that we're doing in transportation planning and trying to shift people out of driving alone in cars to instead taking more shared modes and active modes. So that's the work that the Boston Transportation Department is doing. Part of that is also about making it easier for people to switch to electric vehicles and electric technologies. So that can be within the home, but also in our streets. So a program that we launched recently in partnership with some community groups is an electric vehicle car share program in Roxbury called Good to Go. That is all about just making sure that people have access to vehicles if they don't own a car, and that that car can be electric so that it's not emitting tailpipe pollution. So a lot of programs around expanding electric vehicle access. We do a lot of work with the T to put out rapid bus lanes so that buses can go forward more efficiently, and making the bus a better option for people so that they can get to work on time when people might be going to offices a little bit more. So a lot of different ways. But this is, we're hoping to just be able to sort of grow the wealth of what is happening in Boston so that it's not just the city, but that we're empowering communities to also be able to take action in their own neighborhoods.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. John, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just curious in terms of like projects that might do air filtration in homes and things like that. If there are projects that are purchasing air filters, HEPA filters or whatever for households or for institutions like schools or daycare centers or things like that, is how are like capital investments like that sort of seen in terms of obviously it's probably better for an air filter to be purchased for a school system, or whether it's a charter school or a BPS or whatever. as opposed to just trying like a block of houses, or does it make not much of a difference from the perspective of the program of where those filters would be going?
Yeah, good question, Kat. You want to?
Yeah, I think that my gut instinct is, so right now, I'm actually going to take us a couple slides back to the focus. So I think part of it is thinking about how we're going to have a larger community impact. So I think our preference is for interventions that don't necessarily favor a given individual, but rather will have a positive impact on more people than just at the level of a single person. So certainly interventions that are going to make, I think the example of daycares is one that's really evocative. Thank you for bringing that up. But yeah, thinking about sort of interventions that can have a benefit for a larger group of people is definitely sort of what we are most interested in. That being said, if there's a really compelling idea, if it's something that's sort of trying to prove a concept that for an idea that could be scalable, then I think that it's worth a longer conversation. So if you have something in particular that you're thinking of, that could be, it might be worth signing up for some office hours time so that we can sort of talk through what it is that you're thinking of.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you.
Are there any questions in the chat, Kat?
We had a question earlier in the chat from Kevin. So Kevin had asked how to use the grant funds for a project, which I think you answered in part. They also had a question about being able to fund more than one project, saying that they had 2 different feasible projects. Do you want to speak to that component again?
Yeah, so we're on a good slide with that one. So you're more than welcome to submit multiple applications and have those reviewed through the evaluation committee, but any same individual, nonprofit, or business will only be awarded a maximum of 1 proposal in a fiscal year. So you may submit multiple proposals, but only one of those proposals at max would be funded during the fiscal year. So
I was trying to find the slide.
thank
Thank you for answering that question.
okay. I wrote the presentation, so it's up in my noggin. Right. Other questions?
Looks like John has another one.
Yeah, just another question in regards to a project that might have a focus on sort of assessment in terms of monitoring. Is that, I mean, and looking at the actual proposal focuses, a monitoring project would probably be less favorable just because if it was only monitoring without some sort of intervention, it wouldn't be really meeting the goals of what you're talking about. But if a monitoring project was proposed, would that potentially have any possibility? I mean, if it was maybe strategic in terms of how it was designed.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head with that. We definitely want to see those intervention action-oriented projects. I think we got a similar question, Kat, you can correct me, in our last information session, and we kind of brought up the concept, if that's something that your entity or organization wants to focus on, and there's a partner that may want to take that information and build on it for some form of action, that could be a good partnership in a project, if there's a community partner that can benefit from that data collection, et cetera. So Kat, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or adjust what I said.
Yeah, I think that's just right, Victoria. It's obviously that data can provide a lot of information, but we'd rather see projects that aren't simply just creating that data, but really understanding how that information is intended to be used. Ideally, it's paired with some kind of possibly physical intervention, or you're using that data to communicate with a group of people and try to change behavior, but so that we're not just monitoring for monitoring's sake, but rather that we're using monitoring as a tool to drive action. Thanks for that question, John.
If you have a few more minutes, if there's anything, all questions are good questions. And part of the goal in this first year is to be able to iterate and improve the program over time. So your questions definitely help us accomplish this. So we appreciate all the questions and feedback. All right. Kat, you want to move back to the end of our presentation? All right. So, with that, it's okay if you don't have a question now. We will be here available to answer any and all questions. If you have them going forward, please email us at apcc@boston.gov. Just a few closing notes on everything. If you have a group that you would like us to present to, please email us, and we're more than happy to come and speak to you, give a similar presentation or whatever you feel is best to be able to convey. We want to get this information out to as many organizations and individuals as possible. And so with that, I want to say thank you for joining us this evening. All the information today. Wait, one more question from Nicole. So the partner list is live. So if you go onto this website right here at Boston.gov/clean air grant. So the question for the interpreters, the question was, when will the partnership form be released? So both links are live, so you can go in and submit your partnership request and also review who is on there. There's 2 different links on the webpage. So yes, but yeah, so thank you. All the information from today's presentation is available at Boston.gov/clean-air-grant. And every link we've talked about, it's going to be your best friend. Everything is there. But I just want to say thank you all for joining, and we're looking forward to hopefully your proposals in one of the funding rounds. So everyone have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.